Hi, I'm Ashley, and today we're going to go over a ton of watercolor techniques. So before I dive into the demonstrations and discussion, I do want to say I'm for sure 100% going to forget to ask for engagement during the demonstrations, because I always do. So if at any point during this video you find something that was helpful, that you enjoyed, that made you laugh, whatever, I would appreciate it significantly if you liked the video, made a comment, or subscribed to my channel. So with that, it really helps my channel. It helps it grow. So I would appreciate it. Now we're going to dive in, and like I said, I'm going to forget. So if you could do that for me at some point during the video, that would be awesome. So we're going to go from kind of the more basic terminology to maybe some more specific techniques that you might not have heard of, but these are all different watercolor techniques that we're going to just discuss. So I'm going to start with a wash. So a wash is a layer of color that can be either smooth or transition, but it's usually considered like a basic watercolor technique, and it describes covering a larger area of the paper usually. So this is a wash of watercolor. So it's got a lot of water, a little paint. It can be darker, it can be lighter, but it has a lot of water in it, and you just lay that color. Now it can be, my dog is drinking water and it's very loud. It can be a flat wash like this, or it can be a graded wash, or a variegated wash, or ombre, or a gradient. So there's lots of different names for it, but a gradient would go from lighter to darker, or darker to lighter, or transition from one color to another color. So we're going to put some cobalt on the bottom, and then we're just going to let them mix in the middle. So this would be a wash as well. So a wash can be, like I said, one solid flat color, or it can be graduated, or ombre, or a graded wash, which transition colors. So you can kind of think about, where you might use this. This might be like a sunset sky. This might be just the background of a building, a surface, or a smooth straight sky. I need to stop messing with it because I'm gonna mess it up. But it can be a single color object like just the sky. Usually you're gonna have some transition in color, but think kind of your flat, illustrative, flat surfaces, okay? So those are washes. Then you have another kind of thing that you can add to this, right? So this is a wash. Now we can do, say this is a background for something. We can do wet on wet. Wow, W-O-W, wet on wet. And so if I want to have a bleeded out, let's say this is a sky. I don't know, it's a weird sky, but that's okay. Let's say I want to have some green in the background that's going to be like trees, but I want them to be faded out. I can add that into the wet wash, and it's going to bleed out and make soft, like fuzzy edges. It's not going to be defined lines. Okay. So that's wet on wet. And that's where our color, I'm going to show you over here too, explodes on the page. And the more water you have on your brush, the more it's going to explode. So I added water, and you see that made a bigger line. If I add less water, more paint, it's not going to explode as much. So that's something to keep in mind with water control. The more water you have on the brush, the more it's going to explode wet on wet. If you have a puddle on your page, let's make a little puddle here, and I try to do wet on wet, the pigment's not going to spread the same because it's like a puddle and it's going to sit here in this little puddle. And eventually it's going to all kind of seep over to where that puddle is and create some interesting, weird effects. So wet on wet is where we talk about water control a lot. Okay. The opposite of wet on wet is wet on dry. So I'm going to take my same green here, and instead of putting it on where this wet wash was, I'm going to go right below it, right? And so if I do those same lines like I did up in the wet, you see how they're all soft and diffused, but on the dry, they're going to stay where I put them. So you're going to have defined edges and kind of sharper shapes if you do wet on dry versus wet on wet. Okay, so similar brush strokes here and here, completely different effects. Wet on wet, wet on dry. Our next technique is called dry brushing. So I'm going to take a rag and I'm going to dry my brush off. Now it's still damp. It's not completely dry because it's been in the water and everything. And it doesn't dry that fast, but it doesn't have very much water on the brush. You can see like those bristles are pretty dry. They're not sopping wet. Okay. Now I'm going to take my green color. Okay. It's already mixed up. I can add a little bit more if I want. And I'm going to get my brush loaded with that color. Now for dry brushing, there are different ways that you can do it, but for the most part, you want to hold your brush very horizontal. You don't want to have a vertical hold. You want to hold it horizontal and do a quick line across the page, barely touching the surface. So I am skimming the surface super lightly. Now this paper is not textured. This is very smooth, and I can still get these textural lines by doing that motion. So very, very soft, okay? Very light touch. And you can have more water in the brush. So I just got a whole bunch of water, okay? So now this is almost dripping wet. I'm gonna take off just a little bit of that color, okay? So this is still very wet, and I can still get that line as long as I'm touching really lightly. You can get some texture. You'll see the difference, right? This is a lot less textured than this, but it's still textural versus laying my brush down harder and running it across the page, right? So that's more pressure. This is less pressure. So that's dry brushing. Another way that you'll see people kind of use dry brushing is to separate the bristles of their brush and then kind of tap around or scumble. This is scumbling, where you kind of scrub the brush. People call that dry brushing. Technically, this is dry brushing. This is something else, but it is using a similar technique. It's just a different hold on the brush. So this is a really soft squirrel hair watercolor brush. So it holds a lot more water. If you're going to do those more like scumbling effects, sometimes a stiffer watercolor brush works better. So I'm going to take this, which is a synthetic brush, tap off extra water, and then I'm going to do those kind of scumbling movements. Okay, so scumbling is usually more of a vertical hold and kind of scrubbing the brush around or pushing the brush around like this. Okay, versus dry brushing is more that horizontal hold, drag across the page. Okay, so different brushes are going to give different effects. Different papers are going to give different effects. So a more textured paper with dry brushing is going to change the look. So this is more streaky, this is more dotty, because I'm only touching the high parts of the texture, not the valleys. So different papers are going to give you different effects. But you can, even on a smooth paper, you can get dry brushing effects and scumbling. Okay. Next, we'll talk about lifting. So lifting is where you actually, after you put the color down, you can lift it up. So there's a little puddle right here. I'm going to lift that puddle up with my brush. Okay. And I'm lifting that color away from the paper. I can lift with a brush. If you're doing that, you don't want a bunch of water on your brush, because then if you try to lift, it's just going to add water to that area and it's going to create weird effects. So dry off the brush and then lift away. You can lift with a towel. So I can just dab that paint up with a towel. Okay, or a paper towel if you prefer. You can use a sponge. You can use kind of whatever you want to lift the paint away. Just make sure it's not too wet. Now, you can do this after the paint is dry. It's dry up here. So I'm going to take some water. I'm going to add some water to this corner here. And you can see I'm lightening up that paint, and then I can dab it away. And so you can kind of erase your watercolor with lifting if you made a mistake or you want to reveal something that's underneath, and kind of see what kind of textures or something you can get. So this is creating texture as well. You can see it's spotted. I'm using a textured towel. So you can create some interesting effects with lifting as well, even after the paint's already dry. Some colors are not going to lift as well as others. Staining paints are going to actually stain the paper and leave that color behind. And then different papers lift easier than others. So these smooth, and this is a cellulose, not a cotton paper. Smooth cellulose papers are going to lift easier than your 100% cotton and more textured papers. But still, you can lift some on those. It would depend more on the paint in that situation. Glazing is another technique that uses washes of color. So we did a wash here. It needs to be dry before I try to glaze on it. This is dry. I can glaze on this. So glazing, you want your layers to be completely dry. And then you're going to add another wash of color on top. So I'm going to do, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do pink. Okay, so I have a lot of water here. So it's a light color. It's not very opaque. It's very transparent. I'm loading my brush with that. I don't want to use this brush. I want to use my swirl hair brush. Okay, so I'm loading my brush with the color and then tapping off extra water. And then gently, with not a lot of brush strokes, I'm going to lay that color on top of the other color. Okay, that's a glaze. So if you do a lot of brush strokes, you're going to be, or if you have too much water, you're going to be more likely to lift away that color that's underneath and actually start to mix them versus creating a nice clean glaze. And you can sometimes even like completely erase that underlayer. It's not happening here because that paint's a little bit more staining, it looks like, but you can see that that green is like a lot lighter than over here though. So doing a lot of brush strokes is not what you want to do when you're glazing. You want to do as few brush strokes as you can. And so when you're glazing, you can affect the color or the temperature of the layer. So you can see this pink is definitely pink here, but when it's layering over the green, it creates this kind of almost brown look because we're actually mixing the green and the pink. It's called optical mixing. And so that's when layers of color actually, to our eyes, we perceive them as mixed versus layers. So the green and the pink are essentially mixing, but you can still see they're still distinct layers because you can see the edge here, right? So it's different than just mixing the green and the pink. If I do that, it looks like this, okay? So similar color, really, but it's got a completely different look to it. So glazing can offer a lot of different variety to your paintings. The other thing that you can do with glazing is you can adjust the temperature. So say that this green was just a little bit too blue for you and you wanted to kind of warm it up. So I'm going to take a glaze of yellow, very thin, very light, lots of water, and I'm going to go over that color. And it instantly warms it up and makes it a more yellowy green rather than a bluey green. Okay, so I can do the opposite and take some blue and go over it, and that's going to cool it down and make it subtly more blue. Okay, so glazing is great if you just want to shift the temperature a little bit without messing up your underlying textures or details even. As long as you're not scrubbing or using a lot of brush strokes, you can actually preserve your details. Okay. Another technique is splattering or spattering. I've seen these used interchangeably. I don't know what the difference is. I'll just be flat out honest. So splattering is where you take a brush and fill it with paint. Okay, so I'm using a fairly watery mixture here. And then you're just going to tap the brush and create random splatters. Okay. And if you want them to be more concentrated in an area and you want to preserve like the cleanness of a different area, you can always cover it. Okay, so that's splattering. You can splatter onto dry paper like I did here, or you can put water down first and then splatter into that, and it's going to create a very different effect than splattering on dry paper. Okay, so these splatters are going to diffuse in the water and bleed out, whereas these splatters stay nice and defined and round and they don't bleed out. Okay, you can even kind of tilt it and force the pigment to go different areas, right? When it's in wet, on a wet area. So that's splattering or spattering. If you know the difference, or if there is a difference, let me know in the comments, because I've seen them used interchangeably. So you can also do kind of flicking. So you can take the brush and flick it, okay? And that can create usually some finer dots and splatters versus tapping it like this, where you have generally more water on the brush, and so you're going to get bigger dots. Whereas if you're flicking, you get these finer little splatters. You can also use a toothbrush. Some people use a toothbrush to do the spattering too. So different options for creating those textures. So we have another technique that we can use to create texture, and it's using salt. Literally just salt, table salt. Okay. So I'm gonna just lay down some color here. So we got some blue, nice flat-ish wash there. I'm going to put some salt into my little bowl here. Okay. And this is my salt bowl. I haven't refilled it recently, but I like to keep a little bit of salt here. And then we need this to be a certain amount of wetness. So it can't be puddly and too wet, because then this technique won't really work very well. It's got to be, it has to be wet though, because if you do it on dry, so if I do it up here, like you'll see, it won't do anything. And then we're just going to sprinkle the salt onto that wash. Okay. And then we have to let it dry completely, and we'll see the texture that it's created with that salt. Okay, so we'll come back to that when it dries. And we'll talk a little bit about some other techniques while that's drying. So we have, in watercolor, we can't paint white over the color unless we use a different medium. White watercolor is not really opaque enough to truly go over it and paint it. So if you want to have a white highlight or say like snow on these trees or something, you would either have to not paint those areas or use a different medium. So like gouache or bleed-proof white are very common options to bring in white highlights. You can use white correction pens, like whiteout. You can use different opaque mediums, acrylic, whatever you want that's opaque. But if you want to preserve the white of the page, which you'll hear a lot, preserve the white of the page, preserve the white of the page, then you need to paint around it or mask out an area. So there's something called masking fluid that you can use, and you literally just like take the masking fluid and paint it on to an area, okay? So if I want this heart to stay white, then I paint that masking fluid onto that area. You can use a brush, you can use an applicator tip like this, whatever. And then you have to let it dry. And then you can just paint over that area. And you'll remove that later and it'll make the page white. You can also use something like, masking tape or painter's tape to keep an area white. So if you wanted to do like a horizon line or something, you can put tape there to create a straight line. Everything obviously under the tape will stay white. Okay. You can cut shapes into your tape if you want. I've never done that. It just seems much more time consuming and effortful than I'm willing to do. But you could definitely cut shapes into your tape and use that. And then remove the tape, reveal the white, and then either leave it white or paint it a lighter color later. So those are a couple options for masking. Another option that you can do is called resist. So if you take a wax or an oil and put that on the paper, the watercolor will not seep into those areas. So this is literally a white Crayola crown, okay? So I am going to color in a heart, a white heart here, okay? And I'm just making sure that I have that layer, okay? Now, if I take paint and go over that, it resists the paint, okay? So I can't paint those areas. Now, this cannot be removed later. So that will stay white forever, okay? That I cannot go back in and paint over. And even these little dots that you're seeing around it, those will not dry and seep into the paper. Those will come right off, okay? So that's an option for if you want to keep it just white. You can use a wax resist, okay? So that's like, let's say you're doing a tree and you want to create some little areas of snow, okay? So I put some of that down, and then I'm going to take some green and paint over it, okay? And then you'll see that those areas stay white. Now, this to me is pretty hard because you can't see those areas. So doing a little shape like this is fine, but like actually using this to make this tree, like that looks nothing like a tree, right? Because I can't see where I put the white down. So it makes it pretty hard to actually create that shape that you're going for. But it is an option if you are better at remembering where you put white than I am. But for something like this, like a simple shape, it worked really well. Okay, so I'm just going to show you here, like if we paint our blue around this, blue and green, because that was what was in my brush, and then let it dry. And this is not dry yet. That has to dry for a while before we can paint over it. Yeah, not at all dry. Okay, so like 15, 20 minutes at least on the, depending how thick you do, but you don't want to do too thin because it won't come off. You don't want to do too thick because it won't dry. Okay, so those are different options for saving white space. Another option for saving white space is actually negative painting, okay? So instead of trying to do a resist like we did here for this tree, we can do negative painting, which is painting around a shape, okay? So if I want to do the tree and I want some white space for some snow, I can create that by painting around it. Okay, so if we leave some sections intentionally white, that's going to create a little bit of that effect of some snow hanging off on this tree. Okay. Changing greens here. Not on purpose, just because that's where my brush went. Okay, so we can paint around some of those sections. And that kind of gives the impression, especially if I were to go back in and add shadows on where the snowy parts are, it gives impression of snow sitting on those branches. Okay, so that's another option for preserving white space. We have our different masking techniques, our resist, and negative painting. Okay, so then we have blooming, which we kind of already talked about. So in wet and wet, you have the opportunity to add colors, right? So here, I'm not going to do it again. We're just going to talk about it. So this was blooming, right? I dropped wet paint onto wet paper and the dot bloomed out. Okay, that's blooming. Puddling is another kind of water control discussion. So you can create that puddle like I did at one point and add some blue. And then this is called puddling, where the watercolor just kind of sits in a puddle, and that's going to create its own unique textures. So it is a technique. Oftentimes it's considered kind of an error to have puddling happen, but it's something that you can use to your advantage to create textures as long as you know that you're doing it intentionally. So now that this is all dry, we're going to go back and we're going to remove the salt from our paper here and reveal the texture that is created with that. Okay. So the salt actually absorbs some of the pigment and water, and so it leaves behind these little textures. So that, I mean, in this background, it looks like snow falling almost, but you can create textural effects using salt. Here we have our wax resist heart. I'm going to peel off my tape here, and you can see that it created that white space. Now it does seep kind of up and under the edges a little bit, so just kind of be aware of that. But this top horizon line was really, I pressed that down a little bit better, and that's really smooth. And then this is now dry, so I can paint over that. Okay, so there's my masking fluid heart. So after that dries, we can remove the masking fluid and look at that. Okay, so another thing that we can do is called Sgraffito. I'm nearly positive I'm pronouncing that wrong. But Sgraffito is where you actually scrape the surface with something sharp. So some people have brushes that have like a sharp end. You can use a scalpel blade, or I'm going to try like this toothpick. And so you can actually scrape the surface and lift up some of the paint, okay, and actually create textures like that. So you are damaging the paper using this technique, technically. You can do it when the paint is damp and lift off that paint while it's still damp. And then it kind of creates a different effect where the water can kind of seep in or the pigment seeps into that divot now that you just created in the paper. So that's Sgraffito. Again, positive I'm pronouncing that wrong. Okay, another texture that you can create is with stippling. So I'm going to take a relatively stiff brush. This is a Princeton Select Round. It's synthetic round brush. And so I'm going to take some paint here. And then stippling is where you do little dabs to create little dots of texture, little dots of paint. Okay, so that's stippling. You typically want to use kind of the tip of your brush and you're pressing down, and you can press down harder to create more like fan-like movements, or really light to create more dots. Okay. You can use a fan brush
Very cool.
to do the same thing, and that would be called fan-stippling. Okay. And that creates a different texture. That's pretty good for like creating grasses. So you can kind of tap and then drag up a little bit and create some grassy textures. But that's fan-stippling. Okay. Okay. Dabbing is another term that can refer to multiple things. So dabbing can be similar to stippling, except maybe you're pushing a little bit harder, more water on the brush. It doesn't have to be, I guess, but that can be called dabbing. But often dabbing is like using a towel or a paper towel and actually dabbing the paint off the paper. Okay, so if you see dabbing or hear dabbing, it could be talking about either one of those things. Feathering is when you have a wet area of paint, okay, and then you use a damp brush and kind of blend out the edge, and it kind of feathers out. Okay, so it uses diffusion to soften an edge. Okay, that's feathering. You can use this technique also to kind of blend two colors together. So if I wanted to take some pink here next to that green, and then I wanted to kind of have those feather together, I would take a damp brush and add some water between them. And then it'll just kind of feather out. I just added a whole bunch of water right there. So that's called a bloom. When you add a bunch of water and it pushes pigment away, that's a bloom. So this is about water control, not adding too much water and just letting the colors blend together. Okay, so green, pink, and then they're kind of feathering together there in the middle. Okay. This can also be called soft spreading, or like I said, diffusion. So I haven't really seen soft spreading much, but I've seen it a few times. So feathering or soft spreading, or like blending out the edge, I hear a lot. So you want a softer edge, you can add some water and blend out the edge, but it's called feathering. Okay. Dragging is similar. So you have an area of wet paint. I'm just going to add more paint here. Okay. We have an area of wet paint. Sorry, pulling. Pulling is similar. I'm getting mixed up here. So pulling is similar. So you have that area of wet paint, and then you use a damp brush to pull that pigment down the page, and it creates a gradient. So that's called pulling. You can also push. So pushing would be with a damp brush going the opposite direction. So I'm going to touch the page and then push the paint back up the page. Okay. So it's kind of like lifting, but the goal is not necessarily to remove the paint. It's actually to move it back up away from a section. And then that creates more darkness above it and some lightness below. So that's pushing and pulling. Dragging is like dry brushing. So dragging is using nice thick paint and pulling the brush across the page to create a streaky texture. So it's very similar to dry brushing. Okay, that's dragging. Sometimes you'll hear people say to double load your brush. So I'm going to use a flat brush here, get it wet. Double loading is where you do two different colors on the brush. So if I want to do purple, I'm going to get that on one side and then green on the other side. Okay. And then I can use that to create these little gradients with a double loaded brush. So if I wanted to make a leaf like this, and it can be purple on the edges and then green in the middle. Okay. And you can do that to create interest in your work and just some variety. And you don't have to worry about your palette, because if you mix colors, it's not a big deal. Okay, I just put green in the pink. I can just take a clean brush and lift that green right back out. It's not a big deal at all. And you don't even have to really waste the paint. Just put the paint somewhere on your palette and use it later. Okay, so that can create some interesting textures and some variation. So maybe I wanted to do green and yellow. Okay, so I'm double loading here. My yellow ochre's not very awake. So there we go. We have green and yellow. And then I have that double loaded on my brush. Okay, that's a terrible leaf, but that's okay. That's not the point of this tutorial. There we go, that's better. So you can create that variety within the colors doing it that way. Okay. So if you don't want to do it that way, let's say you lay down your green and then you lay down your yellow on the outside. Okay. Now you want that to blend. So blending is softening the transition between the two colors. So I'm going to use a lightly damp brush and then just kind of touch the edge there. Very light pressure so that I'm not lifting too much. Now this paper is cellulose and so it lifts really easily. So that's something that's easier to do on cotton paper, but you can do blending that way, which is similar to the feathering that we talked about over here. Okay, then there's just some like random other effects that we can create. So we can take a sponge and do some sponge dabbing. Get a little bit more green here. Okay, so I can take a sponge, either natural or synthetic, and do sponge dabbing to create some texture. It can be good for foliage to create that texture. So you can do that. You can use a cloth to kind of wipe texture into a wash or to lift away. We already talked about it for lifting, but let's say I wanted to add a little bit of texture into this. I can actually use a cloth and kind of wipe away some areas to create some texture. And you see that kind of makes it streaky. Or I can dab and try to lift out textures with the cloth or a paper towel. You can use a piece of like cut up card, credit card or store card or whatever, to scrape like we did with the scalpels. So I'm just going to use, this is a leaf tool that removes paper from watercolor blocks, but you can kind of scrape in textures with the edge of a card. So again, that would kind of be like your, I am pronouncing it wrong, but Sgraffito, right? So you can use whatever you want that's kind of sharp, but you can scrape with a card, or you can kind of drag color down with the flat edge of a card and scrape off more than you would with just like a scalpel, right? So you can use the edge of a card to scrape textures in. That can be really good for stones or like rocks. So if I put some dark colors here together, get some browns and grays. Okay. And then it has to be done at a point where you don't have puddles, because that won't move around the pigment the same way. But let's say this is an area of rocks or stone, okay? And I want to create a little bit more texture. I can take the edge of a card, or in my case, this leaf tool, and create some angular marks that's gonna push that paint away. And it can create like little highlights on the rocks. And you see, if it's too puddly, the paint's just going to move back into that area. So this is about timing and water control, but you can create textures that way. And so that's a good way. Again, this isn't a tutorial video in terms of like how to paint stones, but you can use card scraping that way to create some textures, okay, and highlights. Okay, I mentioned blooms when I kind of inadvertently made one, but you can intentionally use blooms, okay? So I'm gonna add some water here, and we're gonna put some blue, okay? There's some blue. Now, if I add either paint with more water than that, or just straight water, then I can create a bloom. So I'm going to add that water right along the edge, and then it will bloom out and push pigment away. It's probably still a little bit too wet. So as it dries, I'll do it again. But that's how you create blooms. You have a relatively drier area, and then you have more paint on your brush, more water on your brush, and you add extra water to the area. You can also just kind of tap in clean water, and it's going to also create these little blooms. So that's a fun way to get texture. Okay. You can, sometimes they're also called backruns. So when you have too much water and it pushes the pigment away, it's called a backrun. Now you can also have just a ton of water and paint and create some drip effects. So if I add a ton of water right here at the bottom, and then I tilt the page, I can let that paint drip down the page. Now there is that surface tension of water, so it really wants to stay there. So you either have to have a steeper angle, or you can spray and kind of force it to drip down, okay? Or just add more water, and at some point that surface tension will break and it will drip down, okay? So that's called like a run or a drip effect. Okay, I'm gonna lift some of that out. And then I'm gonna tap in some clean water to get those blooms again. Okay, you can see those blooms happening there. So then we have something called charging. And charging is where you take a stronger color. So I did the cobalt blue here. So now I'm going to take some stronger blue color and I'm going to drop that in. Okay, and this doesn't have a lot of water on it. So it's not going to create a bloom, but it's going to naturally spread. So this is sort of like feathering, except that it's already in the wet wash. It's not like necessarily added along the edge, but it creates a nice soft transition. Okay, so you're not going to get a hard line. So it's using wet on wet, but it's specifically for adding like a stronger color into that wet wash. And that's called charging. A lot of people just call it dropping in as well. So if you were going to paint like a leaf, okay, and then you wanted, oh, a lot of resist there on that part of the page. I've been touching it too much. The oils from my hand are causing it to resist. Okay, so maybe over here. Okay, there's my leaf. And then I want to charge or drop in some more concentrated color to kind of get some variety and some shadow. I can take a thicker version of that paint or a different color and drop it in along the edge, and then it's going to blend out. Now this, again, this is smooth paper. It's not textured, so it's not going to get as soft of bleeds, and the water's not seeping in as well. So like there's a little bit of puddling going on there, but you get the idea for dropping in or charging. Another thing that you can do is flooding. So flooding is where you literally make like a puddle of water and you really just flood the paper with water and get it super, super wet. And then you can drop in paint to that. And that's going to keep the page wet longer so that you have more working time if you're wanting to work kind of wet on wet. So flooding is an option for really just tons of water, tons of watery paints, and keeping it wet really for a long time. Another thing that you can do, and I don't have alcohol here, but you can use like rubbing alcohol and drop that in on the wet areas, and it kind of acts like water on steroids. So it really pushes away the pigment and creates very distinct round areas of white or nearly white, depending on the staining properties of your paint. So that's an option to create texture as well. You can drop in alcohol. So I realized I never removed this masking fluid. So I'm just going to rub this masking fluid off with my finger very gently so that I don't rip the paper. And then you can see my masked out part there. So it just preserves that white space very easily. You're going to want to test your masking fluid on your paper though, because masking fluid, different brands react to different papers in different ways. And a lot of times it does actually rip the paper. So before doing like a whole huge masked out area, you definitely would want to test your masking fluid on a scrap of your paper with different amounts of watercolor that you've painted around and over it, and then make sure that it comes off cleanly. So that's just a little extra hint about masking fluid. I'm not one to test things because I just am not patient enough, but I do highly recommend it with masking fluid. Okay, so that's just a whole ton of different watercolor techniques and kind of what they're called and what they actually look like. So I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope that it was helpful for you. I really want to thank you. I know this is a fairly long and inclusive video, so lots of information. So again, thank you for watching and taking your time with me here today. And if you wouldn't mind putting in the comments what your favorite watercolor techniques are, or if you have any techniques that you feel like I missed today, I'd love to hear them. So let me know in the comments. Have an awesome rest of your day.